Why are the EU countries, which are heavily affected by this Ukraine war, why are they supporting Zelensky, whereas the US has well lectured Zelensky yesterday, and with European leaders and even US politicians rallying behind Ukraine after Trump's meeting with Zelensky? What will this actually change anything on the ground, or is this just performative outrage? Good question. Also, given Trump's recent actions, do you think he's aligning more openly with Putin and Russia? Excellent questions. Uh, yeah, we're trying to go into the mindset and why are things being done, and why are these decisions being taken by so and so people. So look, we have to understand what is how do we analyze what's happening. I mean, the EU leaders, like you mentioned, are supporting, they're rallying behind Zelensky. A whole bunch of EU leaders have put out these tweets, etc. I'm not sure if I can look it up right now, but like a large number of irrelevant, insignificant EU leaders have put out tweets in support of Zelensky, even some American politicians and so on. Um, so, does this change anything on the ground, or is this just performative outrage? That's a great question. You see, a tweet, if you know me, if you are a long time follower of the Ask Abhijit show, you will know that I keep on emphasizing that there's a gigantic difference between words and actions, right? Words don't matter. The only thing that matters is your actions. A tweet is verbal support, right? Verbal support. Oh, I support you. Yeah, yeah. Pat on the back. I support you. But are they going to actually support him on the ground? Are they going to, send money and send weapons? And are they even capable of sending weapons and money? So clearly, this is performative outreach. This is a performative performance, essentially. It changes nothing on the ground. Can the EU nations together muster up sufficient money on an ongoing basis and sufficient weapons and arms and ammunition on an ongoing basis to keep the war going? They can't. This is called virtue signaling. And so now let's look at what are the interests of the major parties in this entire matter. We know what Russia's interests are. Why did the war begin? Because of NATO's relentless eastward expansion, and eventually red lines were crossed, and Russia decided that we have no choice but to ensure that Ukraine remains neutral, and we have no choice but to safeguard the Russian-speaking populations of Ukraine, who are being essentially massacred by Ukraine since 2014. The Luhansk, Donetsk regions, etc. So Russia waited as long as possible. I think they waited too long. Putin should have done this in 2014 itself after he took Crimea, but whatever. So we know what Russia's interests are. Russia's interests are that red lines cannot be crossed. Ukraine cannot be a EU nation, cannot be a NATO nation. You cannot have NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to be a neutral nation. And Ukraine is historically part of Russia, and so on. That's Russia's position. And they have secured their interests by doing the military operation. That's what Putin has done. Ukraine's interest today is to continue to exist in some shape or form. And that's one. Ukraine's interest, first of all, to continue to exist. It's an existential crisis now for Ukraine. Secondly, whatever population they have left, that needs to be safeguarded. The war has chewed up, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainian men, and even older Ukrainian men. That's a demographic disaster that needs to end. Right? This is somebody else's war. It's a proxy war. The Americans are now saying it openly. It's been a proxy war. I have been saying this for 3 years. I was saying this when it was not fashionable to say that. Today, everyone is saying it. It's a proxy war. So, what's the point of being somebody's proxy? And the Biden administration was happy for the war to go on as long as the last Ukrainian was alive. So Ukraine's interests are to continue to exist in some shape or form, to retain some territory, whatever the Russians have not taken thus far, to end the war ceasefire as soon as possible so that no more Ukrainians die, and hopefully to have a proper leader who actually works towards Ukraine's national interest, not somebody else's interest, which means there needs to be a regime change in Kiev. That's Ukraine's interest. But that's not Zelensky's interest. Zelensky's interest is let the war go on. Now, what is the EU's interest in all this? From an EU perspective, European Union perspective, what they should look at is their economies need to do better. The past 3 years, their economies have been kind of devastated. They've not been doing well. The economic growth engine has spluttered and subsided. Many of these economies have gone into recession. From EU's perspective, their interest is that there needs to be a resumption of the supply of cheap energy from Russia to Europe, so that the economic growth engine can be revived. And they obviously, from the European perspective, would want assurances from Putin that he will not expand further westwards beyond Ukraine, and so on. So that's Europe's interest. The American interest is that this war should end. We need to stop donating this money for this pointless war. And they want a reconfiguration of their relationship with the EU nations, with the NATO nations and all. And they will do that. And the American interest is also to recuperate as much money as possible from Ukraine, because they spent, like, I don't know, 300-400 billion dollars. So they will try and recuperate that through Ukraine's mineral wealth. So Ukraine is essentially up for sale right now. Its resources, its territories are all going to be divided up. Reminds me to some extent of the end of the Ottoman Empire. I'm talking about what? 1919, 1920, around that time. Roughly, give or take a couple of years. That sort of, the Ottoman Empire was essentially chopped up and parceled out to the various winning allies of the First World War, victorious allies. That sort of thing could happen to Ukraine right now. So why are the EU nations and leaders trying to verbally support Zelensky? See, I'll tell you why. Trump came to power for the first time in 2016. You remember that. And he had a very disastrous presidency. He was not able to get anything done, not even that wall that he wanted to build with Mexico, nothing. The entire system was up against him. His own party was up against him. And the entire so-called deep state was very non-Republican, or rather democratic in nature. And this is the machinery, deep state machinery, that controls EU and NATO. So each these EU leaders, they are not really democratically elected. They don't really work towards the interests of their nations and people. They are allowing in immigration, illegal immigration, and so many issues you have in the EU. So these people, they don't really work towards the national interest. That's not they have other interests, and each of these leaders will have a set of handlers, American handlers, who tell them what to do and what not to do, and how to behave, and what things to say and what things you're not supposed to say, and what policies you're supposed to adopt. And most of these policies come from Brussels, which is the headquarters of the European Union. And the boss of the EU, what's her name? Her name is Ursula von der Leyen. She also will have a bunch of handlers. So all these handlers who tell these people what to do are gonna be non-Republican, old-time Democrats, essentially. And they don't like Trump. And that's why the EU leaders also don't like Trump. They are much more comfortable with the Democrats. So there is this tussle going on right now. They are perfectly happy working for the US, but not for Trump. They want to oppose Trump. So that's the tug of war we are seeing right now. But they will not put their money and their lives on the line to prop up Zelensky. They'll simply give him verbal support and so on. And maybe it is they who instigated Zelensky to go to the White House and create this gigantic incident. So that's why they're supporting the Ukrainian president. And because they themselves are not really legitimate leaders. Most of these EU people, except a few, are not really legitimate leaders. Maybe Macron is legitimate because France is a quasi sovereign nation, much more sovereign than the other EU nations. Yeah, so that's a deal.